again, like, say this with all candor, like, we absolutely screwed up the comms of the Epstein files, like we just did. But do I think the reason we screwed up the comms...
We screwed up. 3 words, said live in front of millions of listeners by the sitting Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, on the Joe Rogan Experience. Not a spokesperson, not a press release, Vance himself. And what he said in the minutes after that admission is what nobody expected. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly what happened with the Epstein files, why the release was botched, who Vance is pointing the finger at, and the one theory even Vance admits he can't fully explain. For years, literally years, the American public has been asking the same question: what's actually in the Epstein files? Promises were made. Dates were floated. Politicians on both sides said the documents would finally be released, that the public deserved transparency. And when the moment finally came, it didn't go the way anyone expected. That's the conversation Joe Rogan opened with. He asked Vance directly, "Do you understand why people are connecting dots here? Why people look at the resistance to releasing these files and assume the worst?" And instead of dodging it, Vance did something rare for a sitting VP on a hot topic like this. He admitted fault. Here's exactly what Vance said, as close to word for word as it gets. Well, again, like, say this with all candor, we absolutely screwed up the comms of the Epstein files, like we just did. Let that sink in for a second. Not the media misrepresented us. Not, this is fake news. He said, on the record, that the communication, the messaging around the release was mishandled. But here's the part that a lot of clips online are going to leave out, and it's important. Vance immediately followed that up with a pretty firm denial of the darker theory. Rogan basically asked, is the fear here that whoever is in these files had enough influence to interfere with the release? And Vance's answer was blunt. He said he does not think the reason they botched the communications was because they were trying to hide something. So we've got 2 things sitting side by side. 1, a direct admission that the rollout was a mess. 2, a direct denial that the mess was intentional cover-up. Now, is that the full picture? That depends on what else Vance says. And it gets a lot more interesting from here. Vance doesn't stop at the recent release. He goes all the way back to what he calls the original sin of the entire Epstein saga, 2007-2008. This is when Alex Acosta, who was a federal prosecutor at the time, was running the original investigation into Jeffrey Epstein. And according to Vance, this is where things first went sideways. The federal charges against Epstein were dropped. Instead, Epstein ended up getting prosecuted on what Vance describes as some sort of local thing. A plea deal that, in hindsight, looks almost unbelievably lenient for the scale of what he was accused of. Vance frames this as the root of everything that followed, not the recent release, not this administration. Nearly 2 decades ago, in a courtroom decision that most Americans never even heard about until years later. Rogan pushes on this. Did Epstein go to prison at that point, or was it house arrest? Vance isn't entirely sure of the exact details in the moment, which honestly tells you something too. Even people at the highest levels of government don't have a perfect, clean timeline of what happened in the early Epstein case. That's part of why conspiracy theories filled the gap for so long. Now here's where the numbers come in, and numbers are where things get real. Vance reveals that when the Epstein-related law was signed and the document release process began, investigators ended up with 6 million documents connected to the case. 6 million. Out of those 6 million, only about 3 million were actually determined to be responsive, meaning legally and directly relevant to the Epstein estate and investigation. Think about the scale of that for a second. 3 million documents that didn't make the cut, which raises the obvious question people are asking online right now. What was in the other 3 million? Was it just duplicates and irrelevant paperwork, or was some of it filtered out for other reasons? Vance doesn't give a conspiratorial answer here. He frames it as a scale and logistics problem, an enormous amount of material that had to be sorted, verified, and legally cleared before anything could go public. But he also doesn't pretend the sheer size of it wasn't part of what caused the delays and the comms failure he already admitted to. This is the part of the conversation where things shift from government mishandling to something a lot more unsettling. Vance says he's basically an Ogue Epstein conspiracy theorist himself. His words. He says he's gone down every single rabbit hole on this, and he's willing to go down most of them with Rogan live on air. The first theory he lays out is the one most people have already heard, that whether it was American intelligence or foreign intelligence, Epstein was allegedly using his human trafficking operation to gather leverage, to blackmail rich and powerful people into compliance. This isn't new. This theory has circulated for years. What's notable is that a sitting vice president is willing to say the words out loud on a podcast with tens of millions of listeners instead of dismissing it outright. But then Vance introduces something that gets far less attention in mainstream coverage. And honestly, this might be the most interesting part of the entire conversation. Vance brings up a name a lot of casual news consumers have never heard: Les Wexner. Wexner was a billionaire businessman based out of Columbus, Ohio, and Vance actually lived there for a time, which is how he says he first became aware of the relationship between Wexner and Epstein. Here's the theory Vance lays out. Epstein wasn't just a predator with powerful friends. Epstein was, according to Vance, Wexner's tax guy. Not in some minor advisory role, Vance describes Epstein as being genuinely gifted at identifying unconventional tax strategies. Strategies that could help extremely wealthy people significantly reduce what they owed. Now here's the twist. If you're being generous, that just makes Epstein a talented, if ethically flexible, financial advisor. But if you're being skeptical, and Vance says he is, that same skill set gives Epstein something else: leverage. Access to someone's finances at that level. The kind of access that shows exactly how money moves, what's being hidden from tax authorities, what risks a person is taking, is exactly the kind of information you'd want if you were trying to build influence and control over rich and powerful people. Vance frames this as an underreported, underexploited story, meaning this angle hasn't gotten nearly the attention the blackmail through human trafficking theory has, even though it might explain just as much, if not more, about how Epstein built his network. The conversation takes another turn here. Rogan asks about who actually reported Epstein to the Palm Beach police in the first place. That detail, Vance confirms, is actually in the Epstein files. There's also a mention of Epstein getting kicked out of Mar-a-Lago at one point, which is a detail that's been publicly reported before but rarely gets context in these discussions. Vance's summary of Epstein himself is blunt. It's obvious that Epstein was a sick man. No hedging. No both. Siding on that particular point. That part, at least, isn't up for debate in this conversation. Now, here's where the conversation gets political. And this is the part that's going to generate the most reaction online. Vance brings up Congressman Ro Khanna directly, unprompted, as one of the loudest voices pushing for Epstein file transparency right now. But then he adds the criticism. Vance claims Khanna only became vocal about the Epstein files the minute Donald Trump became president. According to Vance, Khanna didn't seem to care about it during the Biden administration, despite Epstein having died back in 2019, at the tail end of the first Trump administration. This is Vance essentially accusing a political opponent of selective outrage, using the Epstein files as a partisan weapon rather than a genuine transparency issue. Now, it's worth pointing out, this is Vance's characterization of Khanna's record, made in a political interview. Whether it's a completely fair read of Khanna's public statements over the years is something people can look into and judge for themselves. But it's clearly a moment designed to shift some of the public frustration about the botched release away from the current administration and onto political critics. Two more threads come up before the conversation wraps. First, Vance mentions, almost in passing, that Epstein was known to be funding a significant number of scientists. This is one of those details that's been publicly documented for years. Epstein donated to and associated with various academic and research institutions. But Vance brings it up as part of the broader picture of how deep and wide Epstein's network of influence actually went. Second, and more sensitive, Vance discusses what he describes as Epstein's connections to the highest levels of Israeli intelligence. He's careful here to separate this from Prime Minister Netanyahu specifically, noting that regardless of Netanyahu's current popularity in the U.S., Epstein appeared to be connected to elements of what Vance calls the Israeli deep states, separate from any single political figure. This is clearly one of the more delicate parts of the entire conversation, and Vance treads carefully, framing it as one thread among several rather than a definitive conclusion. So after all of that, the botched comms, the 2007 case, 6 million documents, the blackmail theory, the Wexner tax angle, the Khanna criticism, the Israel connection, where does Vance actually land? Rogan essentially asks him directly, were there documents connecting Jeffrey Epstein straight to us intelligence agencies or anyone else's? Vance's answer, no. He's direct about it. No evidence of that direct connection exists based on what he's seen. But then he adds one more sentence, the one that's going to keep people talking. He says that even if such documents had existed at some point, they probably wouldn't exist anymore. Not by 2026. That's not a confirmation of a cover-up. But it's not a full denial that something could have existed and disappeared over time either. And that ambiguity, intentional or not, is exactly why this clip is spreading right now. So let's recap what we actually know, based on Vance's own words. The comms were mishandled, his words, not ours. The original case dates back to 2007, and the outcome then may have shaped everything that followed. 6 million documents were involved, with only half being deemed relevant. There are at least two competing theories about how Epstein built his influence: sex trafficking as blackmail and tax strategy as leverage. Political finger pointing is already happening. And when asked point blank about intelligence connections, the answer was no, with a caveat that leaves the door open. Is this the full story? Almost certainly not. But it's the most direct a sitting vice president has been on this topic in this format in a long time. What do you think? Was this genuine transparency or damage control? Drop your take in the comments, and if you want the full breakdown of the Wexner tax theory in a future video, let me know below.